Bayport's quiet days end when Frank and Joe Hardy, teen brothers and sons of Detective Fenton Hardy, get pulled into a rash of thefts. A stolen car and a bungled robbery point to a bigger job: $40,000 in securities and jewels taken from Hurd Applegate's Tower mansion. The caretaker is blamed, and the Hardys can't let it stand. Their first case starts now: the Tower treasure.
The Hardy boys, Frank and Joe, found themselves in a near-death experience. A speeding, dark blue sedan, driven by a maniac, forced them off the road. "Wow!" Joe exclaimed, adrenaline still coursing through him. As they continued their errand for their father, Fenton Hardy, Frank clutched the legal papers entrusted to him. "After the help we gave Dad on his latest case, he ought to set up the firm of Hardy and Sons," Frank mused. Joe grinned. "Why not? Isn't he one of the most famous private detectives in the country, and aren't we bright too?" A moment later, Joe's tone shifted. "I wish we could solve a mystery on our own, though." Their peace didn't last long. The same dark blue sedan hurtled towards them. Again, they leaped from their bikes, narrowly escaping disaster. "Whew, that was close," Frank gasped. "If I ever meet him again," Joe muttered, his voice tight with anger. They continued toward Willowville, but the encounter left them shaken.
On the return trip, nearing Chet Morton's farm, Frank slammed on his brakes, pointing to a mangled wreck in a ditch. It was the same dark blue sedan, overturned and ruined. "Joe, that crazy driver or somebody else had a crack-up." The car was a total loss, but eerily there was no sign of the driver. "Maybe this happened some time ago," Joe suggested, but Frank's touch revealed a chilling truth. "Joe, it's still warm," Frank said. "The accident occurred a short while ago. Now I'm sure this is the red-haired driver's car." Adding to the mystery, the license plates were missing. They left the scene and soon arrived at the Morton farm. Chet, usually jovial, greeted them with a crestfallen expression. "I'm in trouble," Chet confessed. "Did you meet a fellow driving the Queen?" "Your car? No, we haven't seen it," Joe replied, puzzled. "What's happened?" "It's been stolen," Chet wailed. "Stolen?" the brothers echoed. "Yes, I just came out to the garage to get the Queen and she was gone," Chet answered mournfully. "She was locked, although the garage door was open. I can't see how anyone got away with it." "A professional job," Frank commented. "Auto thieves always carry scores of keys with them. Chet, have you any idea when this happened?" "Not more than 15 minutes ago." "We're wasting time," Joe cried out. "Let's chase that thief." "But I don't know which way he went," Chet protested. "We didn't meet him, so he must have gone in the other direction," Frank reasoned. Joe urged Chet to hop on his motorcycle. "The Queen can't go as fast as our motorcycles. We'll catch her in no time." With Chet clinging on, the Hardy brothers roared down the road, embarking on their first independent mystery. The hunt for Chet Morton's stolen jalopy, affectionately nicknamed the Queen, was on. Frank and Joe were confident the Queen's vibrant yellow paint job would make it easy to spot. Joe mused that the theft seemed unusual, as car thieves typically preferred common models. Frank countered, suggesting the thief might be using the car for a quick escape and would soon abandon it. Their search led them to a truck garden, but the elderly farmhands offered no help. As they neared Bayport, they spotted Callie Shaw, a classmate of Frank's, looking distressed and holding a damaged package. Callie explained that a speeding car had forced her to jump aside, ruining the cake she had baked for a sick neighbor. "That man in the car came along here so fast that I jumped to the side of the road and dropped my package. I'm afraid my cake is ruined," she exclaimed. The boys realized this was the thief they were after. Callie described the driver as having red hair. Joe wondered if this was the same man they had seen earlier who wrecked his own car. Frank suggested the wrecked car might have been stolen as well, making the thief even more desperate. Promising to fill Callie in later, the boys sped off to police headquarters. They found Chief Ezra Collig in a flurry, already dealing with a robbery attempt at the ferryboat office. Ike Hardy, the ticket seller, recounted how a man had brandished a revolver before a passenger interrupted the crime. Oscar Smuff, a wannabe detective, eagerly took notes. Chet's report of the stolen Queen only added to the chaos. As the boys related the story of the wrecked sedan, Frank asked if Hardy had noticed the color of the thief's hair. Hardy stated it was dark brown. Frank and Joe were puzzled, as Callie had described a red-haired driver. Then Henry J. Brown, the passenger who had interrupted the robbery, was brought in. He confirmed the thief had red hair.
"Say, wait a minute. He had red hair. You couldn't miss it. I noticed it after he jumped into the car," Brown exclaimed. The discrepancy led Frank and Joe to a new theory. The red hair was a wig. They suspected the thief had donned it just before Brown saw him, a detail they kept to themselves, wary of Smuff's interference. Despite the conflicting accounts, Chief Collig promised to issue an alert for both the thief and the stolen queen. Undaunted, the Hardy boys left police headquarters with Chet, determined to solve the case. "We'll talk with Dad tonight, Chet," Frank promised. The thought that this mystery might become their first official case fueled their determination.
Back at home, Frank announced, "We're reporting errand accomplished," hinting at more than just running errands to their father, Fenton Hardy, in his study. The boys recounted their day's adventures, Chet's missing jalopy, the wrecked car, and the attempted holdup. Joe emphasized Chet's reliance on them, while Frank remained cautiously optimistic. Fenton, after a moment of contemplation, offered his advice. "I suggest that you boys make the rounds of all shops selling wigs and see what you can find out." Eager to begin, the boys rushed towards the door, only to halt abruptly, realizing their lack of knowledge about wig shops. Joe sheepishly admitted, "Dad, do you know which stores sell wigs?" With a twinkle in his eye, Fenton retrieved a thick file labeled "Wigs" from his extensive library. He identified 3 potential leads, and Frank, ever practical, suggested starting with the closest one, Schwartz's Masquerade and Costume Shop. At Schwartz's, a plump, smiling man greeted them, nearly ready to close. Frank, identifying themselves as Fenton Hardy's sons, inquired about a red wig. Mr. Schwartz, however, hadn't sold one in months. Despite the setback, he promised to contact them if the mysterious wig-wearing man appeared. He then, almost as an afterthought, asked for their help with unpacking a new shipment of costumes. Drawn in by the allure of theatrical paraphernalia, Joe eagerly accepted. As they unpacked costumes, Mr. Schwartz asked Frank to try on a skeleton costume. The ill-fitting garment hung comically on Frank. Suddenly, a loud knock echoed from the front door. Frank, suspecting the wig-wearing thief, dashed to the entrance, hoping to catch him. The stranger, startled by the sight of the lurching skeleton, vanished. Frank, in his haste, tripped and fell, creating a chaotic scene. Despite the comical outcome, the Hardys and Schwartz conceded Frank's theory might have merit. After helping Mr. Schwartz for another half hour, the boys departed, planning to visit the other wig shops on Monday. The next day, after church and dinner, the Hardy brothers, accompanied by Callie Shaw, set off to visit Chet Morton. At the Morton farmhouse, they were greeted by Chet's sister, Iola, whom Joe had a particular fondness for. As dusk settled, the group gathered in the kitchen to prepare supper. Chet, in charge of the meal, delegated tasks, earning a playful protest from the others. As they sat down to eat, the telephone rang. Chet answered it, returning moments later with wide, frightened eyes. I've been threatened," he stammered. A man had warned him to abandon the search for his jalopy, threatening harm if he persisted. The room fell silent, fear palpable in the air. Just as Frank was about to speak, he glanced out the window. A figure was stealthily leaving the barn, heading towards the highway. "Fellows," he exclaimed, "follow me!" The hunt was back on. The Hardy boys and Chet Morton burst from the Mortons' kitchen, hot on the trail of the prowler. They scattered across the fields, but the intruder had vanished without a trace. Frustrated, they reconvened, questioning the man's motives. "Do you think he was a thief?" Joe asked, puzzled. Frank believed the man had been carrying something. They ventured into the barn, the last place the prowler had been seen. Frank suddenly pointed to the floor near the telephone extension. A gray wig lay discarded. "The intruders," Joe exclaimed. Frank examined it, finding no identifying marks. An idea sparked in his mind. "That man phoned you from here, Chet." Chet's eyes widened. "You mean he's the one who threatened me?" The Hardys suspected a more important reason for the man's presence. They pressed Chet to consider what the prowler might have been after in the barn. Chet snapped his fingers. The spare tire for the jalopy. He rushed to the garage, confirming his suspicion. The tire was gone. Despite the Hardys' doubts, they joined Chet in a search for the thief. They scoured the roads on their motorcycles, finding no sign of a parked car or a tire change. Back at the house, Callie and Iola demanded an explanation for their sudden departure. Frank tossed the gray wig onto a chair, explaining about the prowler. Suddenly, Chet wailed, "My Welsh rabbit! It's been standing so long it will be ruined!" Iola giggled, revealing that she and Callie had kept the Welsh rabbit at the perfect temperature. Relief washed over Chet as they returned to the table. The conversation revolved around Chet's missing jalopy and the wig-wearing thief. Frank and Joe asked to examine the wig more closely. Callie teasingly challenged Frank to use his super-duper methods right then and there. Frank accepted, meticulously examining the wig with a magnifying glass, finding nothing. The phone rang, and Chet paled. Iola returned, a worried frown on her face. "It's a man for you, Chet. He wouldn't give his name." Trembling, Chet answered the phone, the others listening intently. "Yes, I'm Chet Morton. No, I haven't gotten my car back." After a long silence, Chet said, "But I haven't any money." "Well, okay, I'll let you know." Chet hung up, collapsing into a chair. "I can get my jalopy back, but the man wants a lot of money for the information." "Who's the man?" Frank pressed. Chet announced, "Smuff, Oscar Smuff." His listeners gasped. The detective himself was selling information about the missing jalopy. "Why, that cheap so-and-so," Joe exclaimed. Chet explained that Smuff claimed he deserved to be paid for his detective work. After a consultation, the young people decided to pool their money. They would offer Smuff whatever they could collect toward his fee, with the caveat that he wouldn't get a nickel if it wasn't Chet's car. Chet called Smuff, who grudgingly accepted their offer of $10 and agreed to pick them up in half an hour. Mr. and Mrs. Morton arrived home, concerned about the threat Chet had received. "You boys must be very careful," Mrs. Morton warned. "From what I hear about Smuff, this red-haired thief could easily put one over on him, so watch your step." As Smuff beeped his horn, Callie called out, "Good luck, and don't be too late. I want to hear the news before I have to go home." Frank, Joe, and Chet found Smuff tight-lipped about their destination. "I knew I'd be the one to break this case," he boasted. Joe couldn't resist asking if Smuff would lead them to the thief as well. Smuff flushed, admitting he didn't have all the details yet. 20 minutes later, Smuff pulled into a used car lot in Ducksworth. "Well, here we are. Get ready to fork over that money, Chet." He led them through rows of cars to a bright red jalopy. "Here you are," Smuff said grandly, holding out his hand. "My money, please." Chet and the Hardys stared at the car. It was the same make and model as Chet's. "The thief thought he could disguise it by painting it red," Smuff explained. "Is that your guess?" Frank asked quietly. Oscar Smuff frowned. "How else could you figure it?" "Then there'll be yellow paint under the red," Frank said. "Let's take a look to make sure." Smuff bristled. "So you doubt me, eh?" "Anybody can get fooled," Frank replied. "Well, Chet, let's operate on this car." Frank pulled out a penknife and began scraping the red paint off the fender. Oscar Smuff's gruff voice shattered the tense silence. "Hey, careful with that penknife." Frank explained that he was merely imitating his father's expert paint scraping technique. Smuff remained unconvinced, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. Frank, undeterred, meticulously scraped away flecks of red paint, revealing a layer of light blue underneath, not the expected yellow. Joe confirmed the discovery. Smuff, visibly flustered, stubbornly insisted it was Chet's car. Frank and Joe exchanged knowing glances. They hadn't explicitly contradicted the detective, but their actions spoke volumes. Chet, meanwhile, circled the car, his hope flickering with each passing moment. Further tests confirmed the absence of yellow paint. Even Smuff's desperate suggestion that the thief might have applied blue paint before the red fell flat. Chet pointed out a crucial detail. The Queen had a long, thin dent in the right rear fender, and that seat cushion by the door had a little split in it. These imperfections were conspicuously absent on the jalopy before them. Smuff, however, clung to his theory. He revealed that the used car lot owner suspected the car was stolen, and the seller claimed to be a farmer from outside Bayport. Frank, seizing upon this new information, proposed a visit to the car lot owner. The owner readily shared the bill of sale, revealing the previous owner as Melvin Schuster of Bayport. Frank exclaimed, "Why, we know him. He goes to Bayport High." The owner then described Schuster, confirming his identity beyond doubt. Smuff, utterly deflated, retreated in silence, leaving the boys feeling a pang of sympathy for the disgraced detective. Back at the Morton farm, Iola's eager question, "Did you find it?" was met with Chet's disheartened sigh. "Another one of Smuff's bluffs," he muttered, returning the money his friends had contributed. Frank and Joe, after dropping Callie home, retired for the night, their efforts seemingly fruitless. The next day, armed with a gray wig, they embarked on a new lead, visiting various wig shops in Bayport. However, Schwartz, Flint, and Reuben brothers all denied selling the wig. Joe lamented to his father that their sleuthing had been a complete washout. Mr. Hardy, ever supportive, encouraged them, reminding them that even one success could outweigh countless failures. As they prepared for bed, Frank reminded Joe of the upcoming school holiday, presenting a golden opportunity to dedicate more time to the case. Joe suggested a large-scale search of the surrounding area, enlisting the help of their friends. Frank enthusiastically agreed, and the wheels were set in motion for a comprehensive hunt. The following morning, Frank rallied the gang, including Chet Morton, Biff Hooper, Jerry Gilroy, Phil Cohn, and Tony Preto. They all agreed to meet at the Hardy home at 9 o'clock. Mr. Hardy, upon hearing their plan, offered his expertise, suggesting they divide the search area into pie-shaped sections on a map. Tony Preto and Phil Cohn were the first to arrive, Tony offering his father's truck for the search. Biff and Jerry soon followed on motorcycles. As they received their assignments, Mr. Hardy noticed Chet's absence. Just then, Mrs. Hardy announced Chet's arrival, dropped off by his father. Mr. Hardy then surprised his sons by volunteering to join the search himself. "How about me teaming up with one of you?" he proposed, grinning boyishly. Frank eagerly chose his father as his partner. Mr. Hardy suggested expanding their search to Willow Grove, a park with a dense woodland area perfect for hiding a stolen car. He proposed a picnic lunch at Willow Grove, followed by further sleuthing. Mrs. Hardy readily offered to pack a delicious picnic lunch for everyone. Chet and Joe departed on the motorcycles, while Mr. Hardy and Frank set off in their car. Hour after hour, they meticulously searched every garage, road, and patch of woods, but the Queen remained elusive. By 1 o'clock, they converged at the Hardy home, loaded up the picnic baskets, and headed to Willow Grove, where their friends awaited. After lunch, Joe propelled his friends through the swampy terrain. Chet, upon examining the discarded tire, confirmed it belonged to his beloved Queen, his jalopy. Frank surmised the thief might be hiding the car nearby, planning a later escape. Their hunch proved correct. They discovered a hidden path leading to a clearing, and there it was, Chet's Queen, unscathed. "My Queen!" Chet roared, ecstatic. The boys piled in, Chet behind the wheel. Before leaving, Frank noticed sneaker prints near the car. Chet's face fell. "You mean he wore my sneakers? They're gone!" Joe pointed out the thief had cleverly swapped shoes, eliminating a crucial clue. With a roar, Chet navigated the Queen back to the highway, the boys cheering. They planned to parade their triumph before Chief Cullig, with a stop to gloat before Smuff. However, Bayport was strangely subdued. People gathered in hushed groups, a palpable tension in the air. They spotted Oscar Smuff, unusually grim. "What's going on, Detective? We found Chet's car," Joe announced. Smuff barely registered the news. "I've got something more important than stolen cars to worry about." He paused, realization dawning. "Hey, what's that?" The boys braced for praise, but Smuff simply declared, "I got a big mystery to solve. The Tower Mansion has been robbed." The news hit like a thunderclap. Tower Mansion, the iconic castle-like structure overlooking the bay, had been violated. Its residents, the eccentric Herd Applegate and his oddly dressed sister Adelia, were known for their wealth and reclusive lifestyle. "Tell us about the theft," Joe pressed.
Smuff waved them off. "You'll have to find out yourselves." Frank and Joe, abandoning their victory parade, raced home. They found Herd Applegate leaving, his gaze sharp and unsettling. "Good day," he grumbled, passing them. "He must have been asking Dad to take the case," Frank observed. Inside, Fenton Hardy confirmed their suspicions. "Yes, Mr. Applegate was just here to tell me about it. He wants me to handle the case." The details were staggering. $40,000 in securities and jewels stolen from the library's safe. "Phew," Frank exclaimed. "What a haul! When did it happen?" "Either last night or this morning," Mr. Hardy replied. "Mr. Applegate didn't discover it until nearly noon." The safe had been opened with the combination, suggesting either someone who knew the numbers or a skilled safecracker.
"I'd like to go along," Joe pleaded. Mr. Hardy relented, securing Applegate's grudging consent. As they rode to the mansion in Applegate's chauffeured car, the man snapped, "I don't really need a detective in this case. Don't need one at all. I know who took the stuff, but I can't prove it." "Whom do you suspect?" Fenton Hardy inquired. "Only one man in the world could have taken the jewels and securities. Robinson." "Robinson?" "Yes, Henry Robinson, the caretaker. He's the man." Frank and Joe exchanged a look of dismay. Henry Robinson was the father of their friend, Perry "Slim" Robinson. To think of Mr. Robinson, a seemingly kind and honest man, accused of such a crime seemed absurd. "What makes you suspect Robinson?" Mr. Hardy pressed. Applegate's reasoning was flimsy. Robinson had seen the safe opened and closed, and he had recently paid off a $900 note despite supposedly being broke. "Perhaps he has a good explanation," Mr. Hardy suggested. "Oh, he'll have an explanation all right," Applegate scoffed, "but it will have to be a mighty good one to satisfy me." At the mansion, Mr. Hardy meticulously examined the scene, finding no fingerprints other than Applegate's. "A smooth job," he concluded. "The thief must have worn gloves." Applegate, impatient, insisted on Robinson's guilt. Mr. Hardy, despite Applegate's protests, requested to question the caretaker. Frank and Joe were asked to wait in the hallway to avoid embarrassing Mr. Robinson. There they encountered Mr. Robinson and Slim. The man was pale but composed, patting his son reassuringly. "Don't worry," he said. "Everything will be all right." He entered the library. Slim turned to Frank and Joe, his voice filled with anguish. "It's got to be," he cried. "My dad is innocent."
The arrest of Mr. Robinson sent a chilling wave through Tower Mansion. Frank and Joe, alongside Slim, listened in horror as Mr. Applegate, fueled by suspicion and a missing fortune, interrogated the caretaker. Mr. Robinson, cornered about a mysterious $900, refused to divulge its source, only stating he obtained it honestly. This secrecy, coupled with his accidental knowledge of the safe's combination, painted a damning picture. "I didn't do it! I tell you, I didn't take that money!" Mr. Robinson pleaded, his voice cracking with desperation. Applegate remained unmoved. "Police station? Hello? We found our man in that robbery. Yes, Robinson. He has practically convicted himself by his own story. Yes, I want him arrested." Slim, devastated, could only repeat, "My dad's innocent. They can't arrest him. He never stole anything in his life." Frank and Joe, determined to support their friend, followed Slim as he broke the news to his family. Mrs. Robinson, already frail, collapsed upon hearing the news, sending the twins, Paula and Tessie, into a panic. Frank's quick thinking prevented a serious fall, and they managed to revive her. Despite the shock, Mrs. Robinson remained resolute. "Surely something can be done to prove his innocence," she declared, her voice laced with hope. The Hardy boys vowed to do everything in their power to find the real thief.
The next day, Frank and Joe revisited the case of Chet Morton's stolen jalopy. They realized the car thief, a known criminal, might be connected to the Tower Mansion robbery. After school, they raced to Chet's house and, rummaging through the jalopy, Frank unearthed a startling clue: a red wig. "Here it is, the best evidence in the world," Frank exclaimed, holding up the wig. Eager to share their discovery, they burst into their father's study, only to find Slim already there, discussing the case. Mr. Hardy, intrigued by the wig, saw a potential link between the car thief and the Tower Mansion robbery. Slim, remembering a detail he'd overlooked, added, "I saw a strange man lurking around the grounds of the mansion 2 days before the robbery." Though the description was vague, it added another piece to the puzzle. Mr. Hardy, armed with this new information, vowed to confront Mr. Applegate and the police, hoping to secure Mr. Robinson's release. "I feel they haven't enough evidence to warrant holding your father, Perry," he assured Slim, offering a glimmer of hope in the face of mounting adversity.
The Hardy boys found themselves caught in the swirl of a post office crowd, all eyes glued to a reward notice. $1,000! Hurd Applegate was offering it for information leading to the capture of the Tower Mansion thief. Joe saw it as a sign that Perry Robinson was in the clear. "Why, that must mean the charge against Mr. Robinson has been dropped," he exclaimed. They soon found Slim Robinson looking leagues brighter than the night before. "Dad is free," he announced, relief washing over his face. "Thanks to your father, the charge has been dropped." But their celebration was short-lived. Though cleared, Mr. Robinson had been dismissed by Applegate, suspicion still clinging to him. The Robinsons were forced to move to a cheaper, less desirable part of town, and Slim, faced with his father's unemployment, might have to abandon his dreams of college and a scholarship. "But if Dad doesn't get a job, it will mean that I'll have to go to work full-time," Slim confessed, his voice heavy with disappointment. Frank, ever the loyal friend, clapped Slim on the shoulder. "Chin up," he said, a determined glint in his eyes. "Joe and I are going to plug away at this affair until we get to the bottom of it." The Hardys resolved to help their friend. They decided to track the thief, hoping to both clear the Robinson name and perhaps snag the reward money for Slim's college fund. Their first thought was to check pawn shops for the stolen jewels, but their father, Fenton Hardy, a seasoned detective, anticipated them. He had already blanketed the city and surrounding areas with descriptions of the stolen items. "I'm willing to give you all the information I have," their father said, handing them a duplicate list, "but I'm afraid it won't be of much use. I had a full description of all those jewels in every pawn shop in the city." Dejected, Frank admitted, "And I thought it was such a bright idea." Fenton Hardy, with a chuckle, declared them rivals. "So from now on, you boys and I are rivals." Undeterred, the boys regrouped. Joe suggested they revisit the woods where the stolen car had been stashed. "We started out to find the thief because he stole Chet's car. Let's start all over again from that point." Back at the secluded spot, they meticulously searched the ground. They noticed something they had missed before: faint circular marks in the dirt. "They're just the size of a man's stride," Joe observed. "Do you suppose that thief tied pads onto his shoes to keep him from making footprints?" Following the strange marks, their hopes soared. "Another clue!" Joe yelled, "and this time a swell one." The hunt was back on. Frank believed their discovery of a battered felt hat in an old jacket was enough to impress their detective father. "Maybe Dad'll take us into his camp when he sees these," he exclaimed. Joe reminded his brother of their agreement. "I thought we were rivals now, and you and I have to solve this mystery alone to earn the reward." Despite Joe's words, Frank's hope was evident as he turned out the empty pockets of the jacket. "No clue here," he sighed. Joe, inspecting the hat, discovered a promising detail. "This hat has a label, though. New York City store," he announced. Frank quickly confirmed the same label was in the coat. "If they do belong to the thief, he never meant to leave them," Frank surmised. "The labels are a dead giveaway." Joe pieced together the likely scenario. He must have been frightened off. Maybe when he found that Chet's jalopy was gone, he felt he'd better scram and forgot the coat and hat. Frank, ever the meticulous investigator, posed the crucial question. "What I'd like to know is whether some hairs from that red wig may be in the hat." Joe, grinning at his brother's sharp thinking, carefully examined the hat under the sunlight. "Yowie! Success!" he yelled, spotting 2 short strands of red hair identical to those in the wig. The discovery forced their hand. "I guess we'll have to tell Dad about this. He has the wig," Joe conceded. At home, Fenton Hardy greeted his sons with a twinkle in his eye. "What? More clues?" he exclaimed. "You're really on the job." Frank eagerly recounted their discovery, laying the hat and jacket on the table. "We're turning these over to you." "But I thought you two were working on this case as my rivals," Hardy challenged playfully. "To tell the truth," Frank admitted, "we don't know what to do with the clue we found. It leads to New York City." As Frank pointed out the labels and the red hairs, Hardy leaned forward, intrigued. "And besides," Frank continued, "I guess the only way to prove that the thief owns these clothes is by comparing the hairs in the hat with the red wig. And Joe and I don't have the wig." With a grin, Hardy produced the wig. "Chief Colleague left this here?" Joe asked. "And there isn't?" Hardy's eyes twinkled again. "I guess Colleague's assistants weren't very thorough. At any rate, I discovered there's an inner lining, and on that is the maker's name. He's in New York City, and I was just thinking about flying there to talk to him. Now you boys have given me a double incentive for going." The boys beamed, but their faces soon clouded. "It looks as if you're going to solve the case all alone," Joe said, dejected. Hardy reassured them. "Nothing of the sort. The person who bought the wig may not have given his name. The hat may have been purchased a long time ago. It isn't likely that the clerk who sold it will remember who bought it. The same with the jacket." "Then the case is far from solved," Frank declared, hope rekindled. "All these are good leads, however," Mr. Hardy said. "There is always the chance that the store may not be far from where the suspect lives. Though it's a slim chance, we can't afford to overlook anything. I'll take these articles to the city and see what I can do. It may mean everything, and it may mean nothing. Don't be disappointed if I come back empty-handed, and don't be surprised if I come back with some valuable information." Hardy tossed the evidence into a bag, ever prepared for a sudden departure. "Not much use starting now," he said, glancing at his watch, "but I'll go to the city first thing in the morning. In the meantime, you boys keep your eyes and ears open for more clues. The case isn't over yet by any means." The boys, buzzing with excitement, could barely sleep that night. The next morning, they learned their father had already left for New York. Adding to their worries, Slim Robinson announced he was leaving school to work at a supermarket. As they neared home, anticipation grew. Frank and Joe burst into the Hardy home, their eagerness practically vibrating in the air. "Dad's not home," Joe announced, his voice bubbling with excitement. "Now we'll hear what the surprise is." They bounded up the stairs and found their mother waiting with a mischievous smile. Mrs. Hardy gestured towards Frank's bed, where a packed suitcase sat, looking rather out of place. The boys exchanged puzzled glances, but before they could voice their confusion, their mother produced 2 plane tickets and a wad of cash. "Your father wants you to meet him in New York to help him on the case," she announced, handing each boy a ticket and half the money. For a moment, Frank and Joe were speechless. Then they engulfed their mother in a bear hug. Within hours, Frank and Joe were soaring through the air, New York City bound. Upon arrival, Mr. Hardy greeted them and whisked them away to his hotel. Only when the door was closed did he broach the subject of the mystery. "The case has taken an interesting turn and may involve considerable research. That's why I thought you might help me." "Tell us what has happened so far," Frank urged. Mr. Hardy recounted his visit to the wig manufacturer. He had presented the red wig to the manager, who, after some deliberation, summoned an elderly expert named Kaufman. The old man, after much muttering and pacing, declared, "It must have been Morley who bought that wig. That's who it was, Harold Morley. He's playing in Shakespearean repertoire with Hamlin's company. He bought this one because he came in here about a month ago and ordered another like it." The detective paused in his story. "I'll go and see him," I told the men, "and that's just what we'll do, Frank and Joe, after a bite of supper." That evening, the 3 Hardys found themselves backstage at the Crescent Theater, standing before the dressing room of Harold Morley. A stout, balding man sat before a mirror, meticulously applying stage makeup. He didn't turn around, but eyed them in the mirror, casually telling them to sit down. Mr. Hardy placed the red wig on the makeup table. "Ever see this wig before?" Morley turned, his face lighting up. "Well, I'll say I've seen it before," he declared. He explained that it had been stolen from his dressing room, along with other valuables. Morley's story seemed genuine, and he readily provided a list of the stolen items. "Not much luck there," Frank commented as they left the theater. "Except through Mr. Morley's stolen jewelry," his father reminded him. The next morning, their investigation of the coat and hat proved fruitless, but Mr. Hardy remained undeterred. They turned their attention to the city's police files, searching for known criminals who used disguises. They narrowed their search to those who were thin and of medium height. After making some calls, they found that all but one could be accounted for. "I'll bet he's our man," Frank exclaimed. "But where is he now?"
Frank and Joe learned their father was hot on the trail of a paroled crook named Red Jackley, a man known for disguising himself with a red wig. Joe, eager to confront Jackley, suggested an immediate visit, but Mr. Hardy, concerned for his wife's safety and wary of attracting attention, insisted his sons return home. He promised to call the moment the thief was apprehended. Disappointed but obedient, Frank and Joe headed back to Bayport. At home, they found their mother engaged in her own form of detective work, focusing on the human element of the case. She had visited the Robinsons, offering them comfort and planning to deliver a much-needed ham and cake. Frank volunteered to deliver the gifts, while Joe, citing a tennis match, promised to handle the next errand.
The following Monday, Frank, burdened by the lingering mystery, confided in Callie Shaw about his unease. He had expected news of an arrest, vindicating Mr. Robinson, but silence from his father fueled his worries. Callie, ever supportive, offered reassurance. Frank revealed the family's dire circumstances, living in one of the city's poorest districts, their livelihood shattered by the accusations against Mr. Robinson. Callie, shocked by their plight, readily agreed to accompany Frank on his visit, bringing along a bag of fruit to supplement the Hardys' generous offering. Arriving at the Robinsons' small cottage, Frank and Callie were greeted by Paula and Tessie, their faces lighting up at the sight of familiar friends. Mrs. Robinson, though pale and thin, maintained her dignity. The gifts were presented, and tears welled in Mrs. Robinson's eyes as she expressed her profound gratitude. Paula excitedly shared that Slim had already found a better job at the supermarket, a small glimmer of hope in their difficult situation. Frank admitted that he had no new information from his father. The ride home was somber, the weight of the Robinsons' hardships settling heavily on Frank and Callie. Reaching the Hardy house, Frank was met by Joe, who delivered the news he dreaded: no call from their father. Mrs. Hardy, too, was growing increasingly concerned, leaving Frank to grapple with the unsettling possibility that his father was in danger. The Hardy household was on edge. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Mrs. Hardy burst into Frank and Joe's room, her face alight with relief. "Your father is home," she exclaimed. "He's all right, but has had a bad time. He's asleep now and will tell you everything after school." The school day crawled by as the boys wrestled with their impatience. As soon as the final bell rang, they raced home, eager to hear their father's story. They found Fenton Hardy in the living room, looking tired but cheerful. "Hello, boys. Sorry I worried you and Mother." Fenton Hardy launched into his tale, explaining how he'd tracked Red Jackley, the suspected thief, to New York. He'd even gone undercover, pretending to be a fellow criminal to gain Jackley's trust. But Jackley had blown his cover by getting involved in a jewel robbery and fleeing the city. Fenton Hardy had pursued him relentlessly, even jumping onto a freight train. The chase had taken him through several states, always just a step behind his quarry. The relentless pace had left him exhausted, but he'd been determined to bring Jackley to justice. "I finally cornered him in an abandoned rail yard," Fenton continued, his voice dropping slightly. "He was hiding in an old water tower. We had a brief struggle, but he managed to slip away again, disappearing into the night. I was sure he had stashed the loot from the Applegate's robbery somewhere in that tower, but I couldn't find it in the dark. I had to come back to Bayport for a few days of rest. I figured the local police could handle things from here, but I should have known you boys wouldn't let it rest." He chuckled, shaking his head. "I should have known you'd be on the case." Frank and Joe exchanged excited glances, eager to share their own adventure. "Dad, you won't believe what happened to us," Frank began, launching into the story of their pursuit of Smuff, their hunch about the water tower, and their daring climb. Lunch, motorcycles, everything else was forgotten. With wild yells of excitement, Frank and Joe hurried down the embankment which flanked the right-of-way. But as they came to a fence that separated the tracks from the grass and weeds that grew along the side, they stopped short. Someone on the highway above was sounding a car horn. Looking up, they recognized the driver. Smuff! "Oh, good night," Joe cried out. "The last person we want to see right now," Frank said in disgust. "We'll get rid of him in a hurry," Joe determined. The boys turned around and climbed back up the embankment. By this time, Oscar Smuff had stepped from his car and was walking down to meet the boys.
"Well, I found you," he said. "You mean you've been looking for us?" Frank asked in astonishment. The detective grinned. With an ingratiating air, he explained to the boys that he had trailed them for miles. He had seen them leave home on their motorcycles and almost caught up with them at the Bayport station, only to lose them. But the station master had revealed the Hardys' next destination, and the aspiring sleuth had hastened to talk to the flagman, Mike Halley. "He told me I'd find you here," Smuff said, self-satisfaction evident in his tone. "But why do you want us?" Joe demanded.
"I've come to make a proposition," Smuff announced. "I've got a swell clue about Jackley and that loot he hid, but I need somebody to help me in the search. How about it, fellows? If old Smuff lets you in on his secret, will you help him?" Frank and Joe were astounded at this turn of events. Did the man really know something important? Or was he suddenly becoming clever and trying to trick the Hardys into divulging what they knew? One thing the brothers were sure of: they wanted nothing to do with Oscar Smuff until they had searched the old water tower. "Thanks for the compliment," Frank said. He grinned. "Joe and I think we're pretty good ourselves. We're glad you do." "Then you'll work with me?" Smuff asked, his eyes lighting up in anticipation. "I didn't say yes, and I didn't say no," Frank countered. He glanced at Joe, who was standing in back of the detective. Joe shook his head vigorously. "Tell you what, Smuff," Frank went on. "When Joe and I get back to Bayport, we'll look you up. We came out here to have a picnic lunch and relax." Smuff's face fell, but he was not giving up so easily. "When I drove up, I saw you running like mad down the bank. Do you call that relaxing?"
When you sit around a while eating, your legs feel kind of cramped," Joe told him. "Anyway, we have to keep in practice for the Bayport High baseball team." Smuff looked as if he did not know whether or not he was being kidded, but finally he said, "Okay, fellas, if you'll get in touch with me the first of the week, I can promise you a big surprise. You've proved you can't win the $1,000 reward alone, so we may as well each get a share of it. I've already admitted I need help to solve this mystery." He turned and slowly ambled up the embankment to his car. The boys waved goodbye to the detective and waited until he was far out of sight, and they were sure he would not return. Then Frank and Joe hurried down to the tracks, vaulted the fence, and ran pell-mell toward the old water tower. "If only we have stumbled on the secret," Frank said enthusiastically. "It'll clear Mr. Robinson. We'll earn the reward by ourselves. Best of all, Dad will be proud of us."
The old water tower reared forlornly alongside the tracks. At close quarters, it seemed even more decrepit than from a distance. When the boys glanced at the ladder with its many rungs missing, they wondered if they would be able to ascend to the top on it. "If Jackley climbed this ladder, we can too," said Frank as he stopped, panting at the bottom. "Let's go." He began to scramble up the rotted wood rungs. He had ascended only 4 of them when there came an alarming crack. "Careful!" Joe cried out from below. Frank clung to the rung above just as the one beneath him snapped under his weight. He drew himself up and cautiously put his foot on the next rung. This one was firmer and held his weight. "Hey," Joe called up, "don't break all the rungs. I want to come up too." Frank continued to climb the ladder as his brother began the ascent. When they came to any place where a rung had broken off, the boys were obliged to haul themselves up by main force. But finally, Frank reached the top and waited until Joe was just beneath him. "There's a trap door up here leading down into the tank," Frank called.
"Well, for Pete's sake, be careful," Joe warned. "We don't want any more accidents with trap doors." The boys climbed onto the roof of the tower, which swayed under their weight. Both fully realized their peril. "We can't give up now," said Frank, and scrambled over the surface of the roof until he reached the trap door. Joe followed. They unlatched and raised the door, then peered down into the recesses of the abandoned water tank. It was about 7 feet in depth and 12 in diameter. Frank lowered himself through the opening, but clung to the rim until he was sure, from feeling around with his feet, that the floor would not break through. "It's okay," he told Joe, who followed his brother inside. Eagerly, the boys peered about the dim interior. The place seemed to be partly filled with rubbish. There was a quantity of old lumber, miscellaneous bits of steel rails, battered tin pails, and crowbars, all piled in helter-skelter fashion.
At first glance, there was no sign of the Applegate's stolen possessions. "The jewels and bonds must be here somewhere," Joe declared. "But if Jackley did put the stuff here, he wouldn't have left it right out in the open. It's probably hidden under some of this junk." Frank pulled out a flashlight and swung it around. In its glow, Joe began to hunt frantically, casting aside the old pails and pieces of lumber. One entire half of the tower was searched without result. Frank turned the flashlight to the far side and noted that a number of boards had been piled up in a rather orderly, crisscrossed manner. "Joe," said Frank, "I'd say these boards hadn't been thrown here accidentally. It sure looks as if somebody had placed them deliberately to hide something underneath." "You're right." Like a terrier after a bone, Joe dived toward the pile. Hastily, he pulled away the boards. Revealed in the neat little hiding place lay a bag. It was an ordinary gunny sack, but as Joe dragged it out, he felt sure that the search for the Applegate property had come to an end. "This must be it," he exulted. "The tower treasure!" Frank smothered a whoop of joy. Joe carried the sack into the light beneath the trap door. "Hurry up! Open it!" Frank urged. With trembling fingers, Joe began to untie the cord around the sack. They were many knots, and as Joe worked at them, Frank fidgeted nervously. "Let me try," he said impatiently. At last, with both Hardys working on the stubborn knots, the cord was untied and the bag gaped open. Joe plunged one hand into it and withdrew an old-fashioned bracelet of precious stones. Jewelry! How about the securities? Again, Joe groped into the sack. His fingers encountered a bulky packet. When he pulled it out, the boys exclaimed in unison, "The bonds!" The bundle of papers, held together by an elastic band, proved to be the securities. The first of the documents was a noble bond for $1,000 issued by the city of Bayport. "Mr. Applegate's property!" Frank cried out triumphantly. "Joe, do you realize what this means? We've solved the mystery!" The brothers looked at each other almost unbelievingly, then each slapped the other on the back. "We did it! We did it!" Joe cried out jubilantly. Frank grinned. "And without old Smuff," he said. "Now Mr. Robinson's cleared for sure," Joe exclaimed. "That's the best part of solving this mystery." "You're right." The boys rejoiced over their discovery for another full minute, then decided to hurry back to Bayport with the precious sack. "You go down first, Frank," said Joe. "I'll toss the sack to you and then come myself." He picked up the bag and was about to hoist it to his shoulders when both boys heard a sound on the roof of the tower. They looked up to see an evil-looking, unshaven man peering down at them. "Halt!" he ordered. "Who are you?" Frank asked. "They call me Hobo Johnny," the man replied. "This here is my quarters, and anything in it belongs to me. You got no right in my room. You can't take anything away. And tanks for finding the wad. I never thought to look around." Joe, taken aback a moment, now said, "You may sleep here, but this is railroad property. You don't own what's in this tower. Now go on down the ladder so we can leave." "So you're going to fight, eh?" Hobo Johnny said in an ugly tone. "I'll see about that." Without warning, the trap door was slammed shut and locked from the outside. "Let us out of here!" Frank shouted at Hobo Johnny. "You can't get away with this!" Joe yelled.
The man on the water tower roof gave a loud guffaw. "You think I ain't got no brains? Well, I got enough to know when I'm well off. I ain't in no hurry to collect that treasure you found in the tower. A few days from now will be all right for me to sell it." "A few days from now?" Joe exclaimed, horrified. "By that time we'll be suffocated or die of starvation." Frank put an arm around his impulsive brother's shoulder. In a low tone, he said, "We won't do either, Joe. I don't think it's going to be too hard to get out of here. If not by the trap door, we'll hack our way out through one side of the tank." Joe calmed down, and both boys became silent. This seemed to worry Hobo Johnny, who called down, "What are you guys up to?" No answer. "Okay, I'm leaving you now, but I'll be back for that treasure. Don't try any funny stuff or you'll get hurt." The man on the roof waited a few moments for an answer. Receiving none, he shuffled across the tower to the ladder. "I hope he doesn't break all the rungs," said Joe worriedly. "We won't be able to get down." Again, Frank patted his brother on the shoulder. "I noticed an iron pipe running from the top of this tower to the bottom," he said. "If necessary, we can slide down the pipe." "How long do you think we should wait before trying to break out of here?" Joe asked.
Before replying, Frank pondered the situation. Not knowing anything about Hobo Johnny's habits, he wondered how far away from the tower the man would go. If not far, the boys might find him waiting below and a tough person to handle. Finally, Frank decided that since the tramp had said he would return in an hour, he must be planning to go some distance away, perhaps to get a couple of his hobo friends to come back and help him. "I'd say that if we leave in 15 minutes, we'll be safe," was Frank's conclusion. Every second seemed like an hour, but finally, when the 15 minutes were up, the boys lifted a plank and tried to push up the trap door. It would not budge. "Where do we try next?" Joe questioned. Frank was examining the seams around the trap door with the flashlight. Presently, he pointed out a section where the wood looked completely dried out. "It shouldn't be too hard to ram a hole here, Joe. Then you can boost me up so I can reach through and turn the handle on the lock." Joe picked up a crowbar and jabbed the sharp end between the edge of the trap door and the board next to it. There was a splintering sound. He gave the tool another tremendous push. The seam widened. Now he and Frank together wedged the end of the crowbar up through the opening. In a few moments, they had sprung the two boards far enough apart so that Frank, by standing on Joe's shoulders, could reach his arm through the opening. He found the handle which locked the trap door and turned it. Joe pushed up the door with the plank. The boys were free. Frank pulled himself up through the opening and hurried to the edge of the roof. He looked all around below. Hobo Johnny was not in sight. In fact, there was no one to be seen anywhere. "Clear field ahead," he announced. Now the boys began to carry out their original intention of removing the stolen property from the old water tower. Frank went back to the trap door, and Joe handed up the sack, then joined his brother on the roof. The older boy went down the ladder quickly, and his brother tossed the treasure to him. Joe lost no time in following. "We'd better get away from here in a hurry," Frank advised, and both boys sprinted to their motorcycles. "Let's divide this stuff. It'll be easier to carry," Frank suggested. He opened the sack and handed Joe the bundle of securities, which the boy jammed into his pocket. Frank stuffed the sack containing the jewelry into his own side pocket. Then they hopped onto their motorcycles, stepped on the starters, and roared down the road toward Bayport. It was not until they were several miles from the old water tower that the Hardys relaxed. Grins spread over their faces. "I don't know who's going to be the most surprised, Hurd or Adelia Applegate or Chief Colleague or—" "I have another guess. Dad," said Frank. "I guess you're right," Joe agreed, "and the most disappointed person is going to be one Oscar Smuff." "What clue do you suppose he wanted us to follow?" "It's my idea he didn't have any. He just wanted to hook on to us and then claim the glory if we found the treasure, so Colleague would give him a job on the force." "Where do you think we ought to take these valuables?" Joe asked presently. The boys discussed this as they covered nearly a mile of ground and finally came to the conclusion that since Hurd Applegate had given their father the job of finding the stolen property, the detective should be the one to return it to the owners. Half an hour later, the brothers pulled into the Hardy driveway and soon were overwhelming their parents with the good news. "It's wonderful, simply wonderful," Mrs. Hardy cried out, hugging each of her sons. Their father's face wore a broad grin. "I'm certainly proud of you," he said, and slapped Frank and Joe on the back. "You boys shall have the honor of making the announcement to the Applegates." "How about Chief Colleague?" Frank asked, "and we'll report Hobo Johnny to him. And we'll invite the Robinsons to hear the announcement," Joe added. The detective said he thought there should be a grand meeting at the Applegates' home of everyone involved with the tower mystery. He suggested that when the boys called up, they try to arrange such a meeting for that very evening. Frank was selected to make the report to Hurd Applegate. The others could hear the elderly man exclaim in amazement. "I didn't think you'd do it," he said over and over again. Shouting for his sister, he relayed the message, then said, "Adelia wants me to tell you she's the most relieved woman in all of Bayport. She never did like any of this business." The Applegates readily agreed to a meeting at their home early that evening and insisted that Mr. Robinson be there. Mr. Hardy was to see to it the Chief Colleague released the man at once. "This is going to be a lot of fun," Frank declared at supper. "Mother, I think you should come along, will you?" "I'd love to," Mrs. Hardy replied. "I'd like to hear what the Applegates and Mr. Robinson and Chief Colleague are going to say." "And Chet should be there too," Joe said. "After all, it was his stolen car that gave us the clue to Red Jackley." Chet was called and gave a whoop of delight. He agreed to meet the Hardy family at the Tower Mansion. "There's one more person who ought to attend," said Frank with a twinkle in his eye. "Oscar Smuff. I'd like to watch his face, too." "At least we should tell him that the mystery has been solved," Joe spoke up. Frank waited until his father had phoned Chief Collig, who promised to release Mr. Robinson at once and bring him out to the Applegates' home. Then Frank called Detective Smuff. He could not resist the temptation to keep Smuff guessing a little longer and merely invited him to join the conference for a big surprise. At 8 o'clock, one car after another arrived at the Tower mansion. When the Hardy family walked in, they found all the Robinsons there. The twins rushed up to Frank and Joe and hugged them. Slim and his father shook the brothers' hands fervently, and Mr. Robinson said, "How can I ever thank you?" There were tears in his wife's eyes, and her voice trembled as she added her appreciation for what the Hardy boys had done. "You'll never know what this means to us," she said. Oscar Smuff was the last to arrive. Instantly, he demanded to know what was going on. Frank and Joe had hoped to have a little fun with him, but Tessie and Paula, unable to restrain their enthusiasm, shouted, "Frank and Joe Hardy found the jewelry in the papers. They're real heroes." As Frank and Joe reddened in embarrassment, Detective Smuff looked at them disbelievingly. "You?" he almost screamed. "You mean the Hardy boys found the treasure?" As all the others nodded, Slim spoke up. "This means that my father is completely exonerated." "But how about that $900? Smuff demanded suspiciously. "What's the explanation of where your father got that?" Mr. Robinson straightened up. "I'm sorry," he said, "but I must keep my promise to remain silent about that money." To everyone's amazement, Adelia Applegate arose and went to stand by the man's side. "I will tell you where Robinson got that money," she said dramatically. "At my own suggestion, I loaned it to him." "You?" her brother shouted disbelievingly. "Yes, this was one time when I didn't ask your advice because I knew you wouldn't agree. I knew Robinson needed the money and I really forced him to borrow it, but made him promise to tell no one where he got it. Then when the robbery took place, I didn't know what to think. I was sick over the whole affair, and I'm very, very glad everything's cleared up." Miss Applegate's announcement astounded her listeners. Robinson stood up, shook her hand, and said in a shaky voice, "Thank you, Miss Adelia." Hurd Applegate cleared his throat, then said, "I'd like to make an announcement. Will you all please sit down?" After everyone had taken seats in the large living room of the mansion, the owner went on, "My sister Adelia and I have been talking things over. This whole robbery business has taught us a great lesson. In the future, we're not going to be so standoffish from the residents of Bayport. We're going to dedicate part of our grounds, the part with the pond, as a picnic and swimming spot for the townspeople." "Super!" exclaimed Chet, and Mrs. Hardy said, "I know everyone will appreciate that."
"I haven't finished," Hurd Applegate went on. "I want to make a public apology to Mr. Robinson. Adelia and I are extremely sorry for all the trouble we've caused him. Robinson, if you will come back and work for us, we promise to treat you like the gentleman you are. We will increase your salary, and we have decided to build that greenhouse you want. You'll have free rein to raise all the rare flowers you wish to." There was a gasp from everyone in the room. All eyes were turned on Mr. Robinson. Slowly he arose from his chair, walked over to Mr. Applegate, and shook his hand. "No hard feelings," he said. "I'll be happy to have my old position back, and with the new greenhouse, I'm sure I'll win a lot of blue ribbons for you and Miss Adelia." As he returned to his chair, Mr. Applegate said, "There is just one more item of business, the reward. The $1,000 reward goes to Frank and Joe Hardy, who solved the mystery of the Tower treasure." $1,000? exclaimed Detective Smuff. "Dollars, Mr. Smuff, dollars," Adelia Applegate corrected him severely. "No slang, please, not in Tower Mansion." 1,000 iron men, Smuff continued, unheeding. 1,000 round, fat, juicy smackers for 2 high school boys. And a real detective like me. The thought was too much for him. He dropped his head in his hands and groaned aloud. Frank and Joe did not dare look at each other. They were finding it difficult to restrain their laughter.
Yes, $1,000, Herd Applegate went on, $500 to each boy. He took the 2 checks from a pocket and handed one each to Frank and Joe, who accepted them with thanks. Mr. Applegate now invited his guests into the dining room for sandwiches, cake, and cold drinks. As Frank and Joe ate, they were congratulated over and over by the others in the room. They accepted it all with a grin, but secretly, each boy had a little feeling of sadness that the case had ended. They hoped another mystery would soon come their way, and one did at the house on the cliff. Later, on the way home, Mr. Hardy asked his sons, "What are you fellows going to do with all that money?" Frank had an instant answer: "Put most of it in the bank."
And Joe added, "Frank and I for some time have wanted to build a crime lab on the 2nd floor of our barn. Now we can do it. All right, Dad?" The detective smiled, nodded. "An excellent idea."